The morning fog rolled across the Pennsylvania hills on a January day in 1980, thick and cold, settling over ruins that had once been called the American Versailles. Where marble columns had soared toward chandeliers dripping with crystal, where ballrooms had echoed with orchestras playing for guests who arrived in motorcades of Rolls-Royces, there was now only rubble. Whitemarsh Hall, the crown jewel of the Stotesbury fortune, had been demolished. Not by fire. Not by war. But by something far more devastating. By bankruptcy. By neglect. By the slow, grinding machinery of financial collapse that had eaten through one of America's greatest fortunes like acid through silk. Edward Townsend Stotesbury had been one of the most powerful men in the world. Not just rich. Powerful. His signature on a document could determine the fate of railroads. His whisper in the right boardroom could shift the direction of steel empires. He was the senior partner at Drexel and Company, the Philadelphia banking house that was to the East Coast what J.P. Morgan was to New York. His wealth, adjusted for inflation, would exceed $4 billion today. $4 billion. And yet, within a generation, his family would be bankrupt. His palace would be torn apart by wrecking crews who sold the marble fireplaces for scrap. His name would become a cautionary tale whispered in country clubs and business schools. How does that happen? How does a fortune so vast, so carefully constructed, so protected by lawyers and accountants and the very architecture of American capitalism, simply vanish? This is not a story about a stock market crash. This is not about bad luck or a single catastrophic mistake. This is something deeper. Something that reveals the hidden machinery of generational wealth, and the precise ways it can unravel when the people who inherit it forget the brutal discipline required to maintain it. Edward Townsend Stotesbury was born in 1849 in Philadelphia, into a family that had money but not fortune. His father had been a merchant, respectable but not remarkable. Young Edward understood early that in America, capital was the only thing that mattered. Not breeding. Not titles. Capital. The ability to deploy money, to move it, to make it reproduce. He joined Drexel and Company as a clerk in 1866, when he was just 17 years old. He worked in silence. He learned the languages of bonds and securities and railroad financing. He watched the senior partners, men like Anthony Drexel and J.P. Morgan himself, as they orchestrated the consolidation of American industry. By 1895, Edward was a partner. By 1900, he was the most important partner. When J.P. Morgan formed U.S. Steel, the first billion-dollar corporation in history, Edward Stotesbury was at the table. When the Pennsylvania Railroad needed financing, they came to Stotesbury. When cities needed municipal bonds, when wars needed loans, when entire industries needed restructuring, Stotesbury was the man who made it happen. His annual income in the peak years was estimated at $15 million. $15 million in 1910 money. That is the equivalent of over $400 million per year today. Every year. Not from inheritance. From work. From being the intermediary between capital and empire. He lived modestly at first. He married young, to a woman named Frances Butcher, and they had 3 children together. They lived in a comfortable but unremarkable home in Philadelphia. Edward worked 14-hour days. He was meticulous. He kept ledgers that tracked every dollar. He understood that wealth was not about spending. It was about control. About liquidity. About ensuring that your capital was always working, always generating more capital. He was, by all accounts, deeply boring. He did not gamble. He did not collect art. He did not throw extravagant parties. He simply worked, and accumulated, and invested with the cold precision of a machine. And then Frances died. And everything changed. In 1912, at the age of 63, Edward Townsend Stotesbury married Eva Cromwell. Eva was not like Frances. Eva was a force. She had been born Eva Roberts in Pittsburgh, the daughter of a coal and iron broker who had made and lost fortunes. She had married young, to a man named Cromwell, and when that marriage ended in scandal and divorce, she had rebuilt her social position through sheer willpower. She was beautiful, yes, but beauty fades. Eva had something more dangerous. She had ambition. She had vision. And she had an unshakable belief that wealth should be visible. Eva looked at Edward, At this man who was one of the richest people on earth but lived like a provincial accountant, and she saw potential. Not financial potential. Edward had already achieved that. She saw social potential. She believed that the Stotesbury name could rival the Vanderbilts, the Astors, the Morgans. She believed that wealth should be architectural. That it should be carved into stone and hung on walls and displayed in ballrooms so vast that guests would feel small and awed. Edward, exhausted from decades of work, lonely after Frances's death, fell completely under her spell. If you are still watching this, still listening, it is because you understand that this is the moment. This is the hinge upon which everything turns. Wealth is not destroyed by earning it. Wealth is destroyed by the decision to display it. Eva began immediately. She convinced Edward to build a winter estate in Palm Beach, Florida. Not a cottage. Not a villa. A palace. She hired the architect Horace Trumbauer, the same man who would later design the Philadelphia Museum of Art. The Palm Beach estate, which they named El Mirasol, cost over $2 million to construct. Adjusted for inflation, that is $60 million. For a vacation home. The estate had 37 rooms, Moorish courtyards, Italian marble, fountains that ran constantly, gardens that required a staff of 30 full-time gardeners. The operating costs alone were staggering. But Eva was just beginning. She wanted something even grander. She wanted a primary residence that would make people forget the Vanderbilts. She wanted to build the largest, most expensive private home in the history of Pennsylvania. Edward, besotted and aging, agreed. In 1916, construction began on White Marsh Hall. The site was 800 acres of rolling farmland just outside Philadelphia. Horace Trumbauer was hired again, and this time Eva gave him an unlimited budget. Unlimited. She wanted a palace modeled after the great English country estates, but larger, more opulent, more technologically advanced. Trumbauer delivered. The final structure had 147 rooms. 60 of those rooms were bedrooms and bathrooms for guests and staff. There were 45 bathrooms. The ballroom could accommodate 500 people and featured crystal chandeliers imported from France, each weighing over 2,000 pounds. The dining room seated 100. The basement included a swimming pool, Turkish baths, a gymnasium, a bowling alley, and a shooting range. The garage could hold 25 automobiles. The power plant on the property could have supplied electricity to a small town. The construction took 5 years and cost over $3 million. In today's money, that is $85 million. But that number is misleading because it only covers construction. It does not include the furnishings. Eva spent another fortune on furnishings. She traveled to Europe and bought entire rooms from French chateaux and Italian villas. She purchased paintings, tapestries, furniture, porcelain, silverware. She hired an army of decorators. The final cost of White Marsh Hall, fully furnished and staffed, is estimated at over $5 million. $140 million in today's money. But even those numbers do not capture the true cost. Because the cost was not just the construction. The cost was the maintenance. White Marsh Hall required a full-time staff of 80 people. Butlers, maids, cooks, gardeners, chauffeurs, footmen, engineers to maintain the power plant, plumbers, electricians. The annual operating cost was estimated at $300,000. Every year. $8 million per year in today's money. Just to keep the lights on. Eva Stotesbury had built the American Versailles. And like Versailles, it would eventually consume the fortune that created it. For a few years, it seemed to work. Eva became one of the most famous hostesses in America. She threw parties that were written about in newspapers from New York to Los Angeles. Presidents visited White Marsh Hall. Foreign dignitaries were entertained there. The Stotesbury name became synonymous with wealth and power. Edward, now in his 70s, seemed content to let Eva orchestrate the social spectacle. He still went to the office every day. He still managed the firm. But he was tired. And he was old. And he was no longer watching the numbers as carefully as he once had. The staff at White Marsh Hall lived in a separate world. They had their own dining rooms, their own social hierarchies, their own gossip networks. The maids who cleaned the 60 bedrooms worked from dawn until after midnight. They were paid $15 per week. The gardeners who maintained the 800 acres worked 6 days a week for wages that barely covered their rent. The cooks who prepared meals for Eva's parties, elaborate multi-course dinners featuring ingredients imported from Europe, were expected to produce miracles on demand and then vanish back into the service corridors before the guests noticed them. These people had names. We know some of them from estate records. Margaret O'Brien, a young Irish immigrant who worked as a scullery maid for 3 years before dying of tuberculosis at age 23. James Whitfield, an African-American chauffeur who drove Eva to social engagements and who was fired without severance when he asked for a raise after 10 years of service. These were the people whose labor made the spectacle possible. They were invisible to the guests who danced in the ballroom and drank champagne under those 2,000-pound chandeliers. When you see injustice embedded in beauty, when you see the cost of spectacle hidden in the margins, that realization means something. It changes how you see everything that follows. Edward Townsend Stotesbury died in 1938. He was 89 years old. He had lived long enough to see the world he had helped build collapse. The Great Depression had devastated American finance. Drexel and Company, the firm he had led for decades, was struggling. The partnerships he had orchestrated, the railroad bonds, the steel investments, were now underwater. But Edward had been careful. Even in his old age, even under Eva's influence, he had maintained enough discipline to protect the core of his fortune. When he died, his estate was valued at approximately $12 million. Adjusted for inflation, that is $240 million. Still an enormous fortune. Still enough to maintain White Marsh Hall, to support Eva, to pass generational wealth to his children. But here is where the machinery of collapse begins to accelerate. Because estate taxes in 1938 were brutal. The federal government took 30%. The state of Pennsylvania took another 15%. Legal fees, executor fees, accounting fees, all consumed more. By the time the estate was settled, Edward's heirs received approximately $6 million. Still a fortune. But half of what Edward had left. And White Marsh Hall was not an asset. It was a liability. An $8 million per year liability. Eva Stotesbury was 67 years old when Edward died. She was still beautiful, still commanding, still determined to maintain her social position. But she had never managed money. She had spent it. She had spent it brilliantly, strategically, in ways that had elevated the Stotesbury name. But she did not understand liquidity. She did not understand the difference between wealth and income. She believed that because she lived in a palace worth $140 million, she was safe. She did not understand that the palace was consuming her fortune. She tried to economize. She reduced the staff from 80 to 40. She closed entire wings of the house. She stopped throwing the massive parties. But the operating costs barely changed. You cannot turn off a palace. The heating bills alone were astronomical. The property taxes were staggering. The maintenance, the repairs, the endless small emergencies that come with a structure that size, all of it kept draining the accounts. Eva's children from her first marriage, and Edward's children from his first marriage, began to circle. They could see what was happening. They could see the fortune bleeding out. They hired lawyers. There were disputes over the will, over asset allocation, over who was responsible for what. The legal fees multiplied. Eva, proud and stubborn, refused to sell White Marsh Hall. She believed that selling it would be an admission of failure. She believed that she could outlast the crisis, that the economy would recover, that something would change. Nothing changed. By 1942, she was functionally insolvent. The income from the remaining investments was not enough to cover the operating costs of White Marsh Hall. She began selling assets. The paintings went first. Then the furniture. Then the cars. She sold El Mirasol, the Palm Beach estate, for a fraction of what Edward had spent building it. The money went to maintain White Marsh Hall. It was like feeding a fire. No matter how much she fed it, it kept burning. In 1946, Eva Cromwell Stotesbury died. She was 75 years old. She died in a small apartment in Philadelphia, not in White Marsh Hall. She could no longer afford to live there. The estate she left was valued at less than $100,000. $100,000. From a fortune that had once exceeded $4 billion in today's money. the lawyers and creditors took most of it. Whitemarsh Hall sat empty. No one could afford to buy it. No one could afford to maintain it. The property taxes alone would have bankrupted most families. The house had been designed for a specific kind of wealth,